Our speakers today, we've constructed this session to try and sort of go across boundaries. We're going to start it with talking about education in the more formal setting and in relation to the disciplines of architecture. We're then going to move to talking about a more global engagement, and that will be through the work of SDSN. We're going to then finish up with talking about education at the local level through a civil society organisation. So I'm really sort of thrilled that we're not just treating education in a perhaps a way that's more normally talked about. We talk about universities or we talk about schools, but we're talking about education that is extremely broad. And I think that's why it's been so nice to listen to Alexandria to think about, what they are really doing is educating. I think the youth movement is on a very powerful mission of education, and I think that's so important. So where can we all collaborate and help with that? I would at this point just like to sort of remind you of the website that we launched this morning. And that website is called the localprojectchallenge.org. And on that website, I think you will find many examples, and this is what I think people have been talking about, is how do you actually inspire people to action? How do you actually inspire them at a local level? And we heard a lot about people, and I think James was talking about this, that you actually are disengaged because the thing is too big. But if you can actually do something at a local level that is impactful, and then that you are also have agency and that you are also empowered, then I think this starts to move the needle on both on commitment and on actually achieving real results. So I would really recommend that you start to explore localprojectchallenge.org. And in terms of kids, I would just like to cite two examples of young people who submitted projects. The first is PS54. PS54 is a school, if you were to look up the scores of PS54, you would say, oh my golly, the academic scores, the rating is really low. But while the rating is low, the work is amazing, and it is a STEM school for science. It happens to be my neighbouring school in Bed-Stuy. And I first became involved with them because of a community garden. And when we started to think about this project, I said, well, we must get Green Thumb involved. And the community gardens is a wonderful way to get the word out about the SDGs. So this local school started working in our community garden, and they've also have a science program. So if you look at the project on localprojectchallenge.org or Matter Matters, you will not only find a school doing amazing work, but you'll find little kids rapping about the importance of bees and pollination. So there you get these sort of fabulous examples of that. Another one is the Rise Up for the SDGs, a small school in the Punjab that is educating its kids around public space, around people with disabilities, about women, safe space, and so on and so forth. So there's much happening, and I do hope you will explore that site. Now, to shift to the education panel, I just want to make a few remarks before we start. This project that we've been involved in at CSAT over the past year has been this Accelerating the SDGs. Part of that, we started it with a survey, and the survey was asking people, how are the SDGs travelling in your world? We had over 1,000 responses from around the world, 92 countries in fact, and what we found was that about 35% of our respondents had not heard of the SDGs. And if they had, they would mostly have heard of Goal 11. And now that might be sort of reasonable to expect because it was a city makers survey. We don't know, of course, exactly who answered it. But what we also found was that they were least familiar with Goal 13, climate action. They were not very familiar with life on land, which is Goal 15, And that, of course, deals with the sort of biodiversity, about the impact, say, on the built environment. So that was also a surprise. So you could say there's plenty of room for action in the education sphere. We also targeted youth because, much as Alexandria was saying, it seems to me that the youth are really taking the running on this. So we went back into our data to look at the age group 18 to 34 to see what they were saying in this survey. And what they were saying was that they thought the SDGs were important, and in regards to education, there was a predominant view that the educational institutions needed to lift their game. That was what we heard. They needed to lift their game. So that provides some sort of a background for this education panel. But before we actually go into that, I want to just raise another point, which this morning we heard people saying, well, we're talking to the same sort of people, and we have to branch out. And I couldn't agree more. The question is actually how you do that. It's actually quite difficult. So in writing up this report of the survey we did a little research into who else has been doing surveys, what have they been finding, and there's one that's very interesting called SDGs in Order. And what that's about is how do people rank the importance of the SDGs? I just mentioned to you that SDG 11, the cities goal, is the one that comes to mind when you ask city makers. Now, this ranking in the SDG order, and the people asked were foundations, universities, think tanks, and government. And you might be surprised, or you might not be surprised, to find number one that they put ahead of everything was reduce inequalities. After that came no poverty. After that came gender equality. Climate action was number 11 out of 17. Life on land was number 15. And sustainable cities and communities was number 16. So here is a very interesting sort of question, it seems to me, is that you talk to different sorts of people and you get different priorities. So with that, I would like to introduce the panellists, and we're going to start with Harriet Harris, who is from the Pratt School of Architecture, and we're going to have these a few presentations, and then we'll open it up to discussion. So welcome, Harriet. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. In response to the brief, when I was asked to come up with two proposals about the implementation of the SDGs, I felt somewhat that I would like to subvert the brief and in a way propose a meta-solution. And the meta-solution is to consider the decolonisation of architectural education's curriculum. So I'm going to explain why I'm taking this view and present some strategies for how that could work, working in a kind of hack way with these two laptops because there's no presenter view. Okay, so, oops, jeez. Okay, there we go. So you may have heard of Pratt, I'm sure. It's got a long history in Brooklyn. And as with every other institution in higher education these days, there is an obligation to generate these things called strategic plans, which makes us all sound terribly corporate, but on a positive note, commits us to a charter of themes or principles through which we deliver our educational programs. Our strategic plan, I think, quite interestingly, as I'm illustrating here, resonates with a number of the SDGs. We have a commitment to diversity, equality, equity and inclusion, and that resonates with SDG 5 and 10, with global education, academic excellence and student success. And I apologise, the slides got scrambled, but something in the translation between Google Images and this old PC has done some strange alchemy with the text, but anyway. And also, and obviously those three principles relate very keenly to SDG 4, quality education, SDG 13, climate action. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And then finally, our fifth tenet, which is civic engagement, speaks very keenly to SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, and 17 around civic partnerships. So what's interesting about Pratt is that it didn't just invent this stuff last year when it came up with this strategic plan. Charles Pratt, who is its founder, was a child of 11 children, and he was born into complete poverty, but then became a rather terrifying polluter of Greenpoint and much of the East River through his oil refineries. This is the site, in fact, where most of the destruction was levelled against the East River. So in a funny kind of way, that sort of, you're dealing with somebody who, on principle, enshrined the idea of education accessible to all within the Brooklyn community. In fact, from its opening, Pratt was always gender inclusive, which is unusual, particularly in 1887, which is when the school was founded. But then, of course, now it's got this reputation as being always very politically correct and very ethical, but it has this sort of shady past in relation to the climate and pollution. And I find that kind of interesting because when I'm here advocating for my institution, I think there's a reckoning around how do we consider our responsibilities as institutions when we have these aspects of our heritage. But the interesting thing also about Pratt is that he decided that along with having access to education, that every single worker should have the right to decent homes and accommodation. And obviously that, I think, speaks a lot to Goal 11 around sustainable cities and so on, and again around access and inclusion. And so he designed housing complexes like this, which ensured that the workers had somewhere decent to live. And it's, in fact, the rents from these social housing projects that generated the revenues that funded Pratt. So in a funny kind of way, social housing became the rinse cycle on the dirty money of oil refineries. So I am positioning my case today that architecture should be more effective at delivering the SDGs, but that it can't, and its obstacles are incredibly complicated. But they're profoundly connected, I think, to what's happening with the climate. So it's very interesting to walk in, and this is what we're now talking about. So sorry to miss the morning, but it's great that we're on this particular page. And I'm referring here, and I'm sorry about the shady image, but this is actually the number of miles of materials had to travel to build the Empire State Building. And you can just sort of see something of the codependency between the minds of the Global South and the construction and the building aspirations of the Global North. This is Keel Mo's work, by the way. He's an astonishing scholar, and he's actually based at Columbia. Of course, architecture, in terms of its contribution as a broader, if you like, campus of construction industry, we know that the construction industry is responsible for around 4% of the particulate emissions in the US, which is pretty substantial, that it's concreting the planet at a rate of increase rate of 2.5% increase every year on average. On top of this, that we know that in the US in particular, it's responsible for 44% of the American CO2. So it's interesting that, we kind of talk about our responsibility as educators towards this curriculum, which is all about diversity and other matters, when in fact I would argue that inherent in the idea of tackling climate crisis is an issue around diversity and access and so on. So I'm going to talk to that case now, trying to work between these two devices. So I think there are a number of ways that we can start to deconstruct architecture and reimagine it, but it comes back to understanding that pedagogy and not just the profession is implicated. What we are now teaching in schools of architecture, and we're positioning it as established knowledge, the tenets, the classics, and so on, is embedded with a lot of baggage around colonialism, around disproportionate wealth and affluence, and around exploitation. But that's all somehow embedded into what we teach, and there isn't really enough criticality about where this knowledge has come from. So this is my attempt at a consolidated definition of what decolonising the curriculum is. It's still a very emergent set of ideals and philosophies within pedagogy and more generally, but this is, I think, one way of capturing it. And I suppose if one is going to consider the obstacles that I would say architecture curriculum in particular, but also higher education institutions more generally present, we could start by looking at how, in much the same way I did, looking at the oil refineries, critically understanding what has been the origins of the affluence of our institution. So, for example, Harvard, one example of about 7 in the US, was largely funded by slavery in the South. Not everybody has a statue to rip down, but there are other ways that I would say the building's materiality becomes a form of monument in itself, and that's in some ways part of the crisis we have in understanding notions of embodied energy as a political force. Similarly, who authors knowledge? So if you were to jump onto Google and do a quick Google of master architect, it's interesting how you won't see any women architects or indeed many non-white people in this particular canon sample, if you like. So there's a real question around not only who gets to teach architecture, but also who gets to author its content, and how that really has not been effectively contested, despite very conspicuous appropriation, genre upon genre, from the global north of the global south's architectural traditions, techniques, philosophies, materials, and so on. Similarly, I would argue that affordability becomes a major issue in relation to all of these goals, but certainly in terms of our commitment, our serious commitment to diversity and inclusion within universities. And it comes to simple metrics around income differentials, if you're from a white family or if you're from a black family in this country, and just how much greater the obstacles are in terms of you entering higher education at all, regardless of the discipline you study. Similarly, gender representation and leadership is another issue. So if we're serious about Goal 5, gender equality, then putting women into positions of power within institutions is a way to start shifting the shape of curriculum and pedagogy towards addressing excluded communities and representing more equally diversity in an embedded but also in a strategic way. These are some, I would say, fairly startling statistics regarding the differential between my hometown, and it really is a town in the provincially minded sense of the UK, and the US. Similarly, what we also see within architecture is that, and this speaks again to this notion of pedagogy being implicated, that we fail to retain students effectively, particularly in the UK and other cultures in the global north, where there's a big emphasis on certain types of learning and certain kind of bullish and somewhat masculine privileging forms of learning, the crit, being able to justify yourself all the time. Long hours culture doesn't work well if you've got a kid, right? So the other thing we have in relation to retention imbalances is again this issue of seeing massive fallout from what we call the BAME community. BAME in Britain means Black and Asian Minority Ethnic, so we use a different kind of euphemism and acronym than the US do, but again, this is implicating not just of the conditions of under profession, which are often long working hours, poor pay, and so on, and precarity, which is another problem, but more generally thinking about what schools are doing that is not supporting and sustaining diversity within their cohorts. Unconscious bias, I'm sure you're aware of this. Again, this is another barrier to diversity and inclusion, and also Goal 4 of just education more generally. So there was a phenomenal study that identified that even students coming into schools, it's not that the schools themselves are necessarily merrily teaching prejudice. Even students as young as 18 are coming into schools and being asked to complete evaluation surveys of their professors, and are more likely to describe their female professors as bossy and their male academic of the same qualification and status for the institution as genius. So, we already have issues around how do we kind of confront some of the ideas being brought into the school. And similarly, linguistic relativity. So we teach architecture fundamentally in English, and when we think about identification of how that asserts a set of values around architectural production, around architectural taste, around architectural culture, but also when you start to look at many of the European languages, when objects are gendered, so in some languages a bridge is masculine, in others it's female, and so on, and how through various studies, and there was a very interesting one done by Frelilino and Caswell and Lasco, that people would assign a gender quality to an object just based on its assignation. So ask a German if a key is, to describe the qualities of a key, and they might describe it as robust, enduring, and hard. Ask a Spaniard who would identify as a key as a feminine artifact, and it's more likely to be described as intricate and delicate. So very interesting contrast in how these gender assignations prejudice our perceptions of what these objects are. And then, I'm nearly at the end and sticking to time, the cultural subjectivity of pedagogies as well. So again, a lot of the learning theories, a lot of the pedagogic discourse is coming from, I would say, not only carrying a lot of class bias towards a certain level of confidence within students, a certain level of ability to communicate and feel themselves as belonging and equal at the table within the discourse of higher education, but also just in terms of what systems of teaching are recognised and also used to assess students' work, and how entirely problematic that is. I have written a book about this. There's no time to talk about it, just saying. And then finally, when we talk about decolonising the curriculum more generally, of course, one of the biggest problems is that decolonization is far from over. If you look at the supply chain in the construction industry and how we understand energy, for example, when we need to start talking about embodied energy, not just in terms of the production values and CO2, but start thinking about the lives involved in manufacturing the raw materials that come into construction materials in the supply chain. And invariably, at some point in any element, even if some of the production has been sustainable from a material perspective, it's likely that there was some form of exploitative labor. There are over 120 million slaves in the construction industry worldwide. I think we have to understand that we are very definitely implicated as a profession. So, of course, what does this then do? At the moment, architecture is perceived as being complicit with questionable political regimes. Is just one example of the architecture competition where many architects queued up to start responding to Trump's competition, to prototype bits of the wall against Mexico. We had at the time the president of the IAA saying we need to get behind Trump, and then membership of the IAA slumped overnight, as you can imagine. So, at the moment, I think people identify construction industry generally, and architecture in particular, as necessarily being disconnected and not at all engaged in being in any way strategic or propositional about how to confront climate change generated inequalities. But the good news is architecture is somewhat epistemologically promiscuous, and by this I mean it isn't really a discipline, if we're honest. It's more of a practice. It's more of a love child of many, many epistemologies and disciplines. But it's this, if you like, promiscuity that gives us its richness, its tenacity, its ability to flex, to fold, to respond to all of these rather challenging crises we are facing as a planet and as a society. And I take that to mean a global society. So I think with this richness, there is an opportunity for us to step up. I think we are underutilizing our skill sets in this way, and I think that it's understanding our potential in this particular range of skills and knowledge foundations and so on, and methods and processes that really helps me believe that we can be so much more proactive and propositional about finding a solution. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Harriet. Sorry you had to fight the technology. Absolutely wonderful talk, and issues that were sort of touched on a little bit this morning as well, questions of gender. And I guess I would just like to suggest that of those of you who do not know the organisation Parla, which is, I think, Australian-based, but certainly present in the UK as well, has been a very active organisation about the role of women in architecture. So I'd now like to welcome Kaya Kool, who is teaching urban design here at Columbia, to make her contribution.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Anna and Gita, for inviting me. Okay. Go ahead and get my presentation.
And then there's a clicker here if you would like to use that.
Okay, rather than
Or
this.
either one.
And does it show up here? Yeah. Okay, so I've been fighting a cough, and I hope I can make it through this presentation without coughing up too much or grabbing the water. I want to talk a little bit about one particular goal, and that is the climate action goal. And in the context of some of the things that Alexandria said earlier, and when the SDGs were adopted in 2015, they were called an urgent call for action. So this is an image from the most recent climate march in September. And I would argue that since 2015, the urgency has only increased, but not necessarily the action. And so this is sort of an image that motivates my teaching and thinking and research about the topic of sustainable development and climate action, but it's not what informs it. I also kind of decided to put my sort of contribution to collecting ideas for action here at the front. And what I'm going to talk about is We need to ask more questions and unpack systems as part of our higher education where I teach, but also as public education in general. And I think, especially in our profession, it's important for us to make solutions visible. And I'll speak a little bit more about what I mean with that. So this is what informs my teaching. And it's not so I want to say it's not the science around sea level rise or the Arctic melting, the fires, the droughts, although that, of course, is all sort of important to realize and understand. But I do think in discussion we focus a little bit too much on that, and we don't focus on understanding the systems that are behind creating this. And so while the slide might suggest that what informs my teaching is numbers, it's also not really the numbers. What I'm most interested in and what drives the curiosity is, what does transportation actually mean in this slide, or what does buildings mean? Do we understand and teach the embodied energy of materials that we use to build our cities, the operational energy they use, and have we established sort of as the status quo and manifested in our codes and systems safety regulations that require us to actually use this energy? Same for transportation. We kind of all feel like, yes, we know the solution, electric cars, but as urban designers, we also know that's not really the solution, and we need to dig a little deeper in understanding these systems of transportation that currently drive up our carbon emissions to unpack and develop and visualize solutions of how to get out of the way we currently live. Things like industrial processes, one of these little things here at the bottom. Does anyone know what ODS is? Thought so. It's the number one thing that the Drawdown Project suggests is what we could do to address reducing CO2 emissions. It stands for ozone depleting substitutes. It's refrigerants. So the way we air condition and refrigerate is really something that is a massive contributor, and just upgrading all of these systems would reduce our CO2 emissions enormously. And keep in mind, so this is the greenhouse gas inventory for New York State. Globally, some of these numbers look very different. What informs teaching is really sort of looking behind these words and understanding. And I just want to give you the source for this. And so while this may have looked overwhelming, you can imagine that this took a few days to unpack. And I think in education, it's our role to unpack these systems and really understand what kinds of infrastructures we created to support our way of life. So action number one is really to start asking these questions and unpack these systems. I currently teach Urban Design Studio. It's a graduate studio here at Columbia University, focused on the climate crisis. We're working in the Hudson Valley now in our 6th year with this group. And we're part of a larger group of courses at the architecture school that is looking at public works for a Green New Deal. This is the entire group, so it's kind of a big undertaking. There's a team of 9 faculty members, very interdisciplinary, and 56 students. And I want to show you a few examples of the work that is in progress to sort of get a sense of how we're beginning to unpack and just really develop knowledge together as a team. And this is really the team of faculty and students together to understand these systems that got us here. We're using the Green New Deal, House Resolution 109, as sort of a guide. And a lot of this reads like an urban design brief with literally building resiliency against climate change-related disasters, to meeting 100% of the power demand in the United States through clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy sources. And I could go on pages. So the Green New Deal is sort of another version of a set of ambitions similar to the SDGs that sets out goals, but is also ambiguous enough to fill it with meaning and fill it with solutions. So here's our context in the Hudson Valley. This is a map that one student team did looking at emissions from transportation. It could also be a map of density, because clearly what you can see here is in New York City, where density is higher, emissions are also higher. 70% of residents in the Hudson Valley drive alone to work. So transportation being one of the biggest culprits, how do we get around this? And electric cars are still a car. But I want to talk about 3 projects in a little bit more detail. And starting sort of with the stuff that cities are made of, the construction materials. One of our teams is looking at the waste from the construction industry. Globally, the production and use of cement contributes about 8% to all greenhouse gas emissions. In New York State, this is a little less. But that's because we already have a lot of cement, and we've already built up a lot of our spaces with concrete. Here's a slide sort of mapping over 130,000 acres of abandoned industries and warehouses and parking lots, many of which are contaminated and polluted. So it's not only that we've built an enormous urbanized region here, we've abandoned a lot of it too, but their contribution to greenhouse gas emissions occurred at the construction, and many of them lay fallow, as is the case with this former IBM manufacturing site. It employed at some point 7,000 people. It's north of Kingston. It was abandoned actually in 1995, I believe, or it was sold for $3 million to the current owner, who was the owner until last week. The county foreclosed it because he didn't pay his taxes or utilities. And so now there's an environmental liability on the site for more than $4 million and a tax liability for about $12 million. And it looks like this. And so this is a site that one of the teams is looking at to see whether the site itself can actually be dismantled and become a place for recycling of construction materials in the entire valley. And so the idea behind this is that the Hudson Valley has really been a source of construction material for New York City and the entire region for centuries. And can we use this region again to become a place of material innovation and research around construction material? There are estimates that say about 65% of the energy in material production for construction could be saved if materials would be recycled. And so on the left are some examples of what these things could be turned into. And again, this is sort of work in progress. So here are some early studies of how to actually build this on the site. And hopefully in a few weeks we'll see a more detailed design of how, both as a site-specific design for this place, this place can have a new life that reduces the emissions of an entire region, but also shows a way of how we can think about materials systemically. Another example we've been looking at is the carbon footprint of healthcare. About 10% of the emissions in the United States are accounted to the healthcare industry, and that is, no surprise, much higher than any other country in the world by a lot. And so what we find in this region in particular is that a lot of these emissions come from large healthcare facilities, hospitals. Here they happen to be in the cities of the region. Many of them are often half vacant, meaning more than 50% of their beds are not occupied. People in the region still drive up to an hour and a half for healthcare services. So there's something often when politicians talk currently much about the need for Medicare for all, and that is all the discussion. It's not even addressing it doesn't even scratch the surface of what the problem really is, which is that even if it is financially accessible, it may not be physically accessible. And it is a system that is literally contributing to our relatively, compared globally, low health status. And so this group, and again, this work in progress, is looking at ideas of how you could retrofit both hospital facilities, but also think about decentralizing sort of healthcare services. And I think what most experts are in agreement of, public health experts that is prevention is really the best way to drive down also the carbon emissions of healthcare, because then no one would have to use these facilities in the first place. And then the last example that I want to show where we're asking questions and are developing sort of an understanding and visualizing an understanding of a larger system is agriculture. And this is, of course, has been a lot in the news. Our food systems contribute, I think, globally anywhere between 20 and 30% to greenhouse gas emissions. And we've all been told that we can no longer eat meat. And so we're looking here at a system where we're refining our understanding of what that means. We can no longer eat meat in the amounts that we have been eating it, because that is often, through globalized systems, that meat is being produced in countries where forests are being cut down and are no longer available as carbon sinks to grow more livestock or feedstock to feed cattle. This team is looking at an agriculture system of regenerative agriculture in the Hudson Valley, where agriculture, and especially actually meat and cattle growing, can be part of the solution if done well. Cattle farms can absorb more carbon than the methane from the animals would actually, or more greenhouse gases than the methanes from the animals would actually release. It requires a lot of land, and it requires a lot of rotation of these animals so that they can actually help fertilize the land and help sort of manage to keep the carbon in the soil. In the Hudson Valley, most farms are relatively small, so in this case, it requires sort of a collaborative process of traveling or migrating cattle, across entire regions from farm to farm. And as we know, this is a region where we're losing farmland to sometimes developments, but also sometimes just sort of landowners who are buying up landscapes, farm properties, acres that are not using for farming anymore. The idea of the system is that you could lease this land or lend this land to farmers who would move their cattle or their sheep through the land in order to create a more productive soil. It also has sort of the co-benefits, and I think that's part of what all of these projects are about, is that if climate action is the priority, and priority was something that was discussed in the earlier panel this morning too, it doesn't mean that not many of the other goals that we have cannot also be achieved, but to have sort of climate action as a priority is sort of helping us to fix the goalpost. And in this case, the idea is, of course, that what is a good path for cattle to move is also a good path for children to move safely to school. It's a good path for people to exercise. It can connect villages in this relatively low-density area. And can create sort of spaces along those paths, be it for tourism or be it, and therefore the economy or the local community alike. So these are just some of the examples that are in progress. The final work can be seen on December 7th at a workshop where we have a total of 14 projects that we will present. And not just present, but discuss really, because what we hope to see is that this becomes not sort of a classic final review that is, those of you who have gone through architecture education might be familiar with, but that it really becomes sort of a conversation among a larger group about how we can, again, sort of bring the two action items that I mentioned at the beginning to the forefront, which is we need to ask questions to actually understand how these systems work that make us produce and use so many greenhouse gases, this large amount of greenhouse gases. And we need to understand and make visible the actions that we all can take, the solutions that we all can see for the future. Thank you.
very, very much. I think this making visible is really important. I myself have done lots of reviews teaching architecture, and one invites the visitors, but this notion of making visible to make the sort of work and ideas come to the front, I think it's just so important. And so I hope that was a general invitation to everybody. Very good, very good. And the other thing I just want to say is that must have been Veterans Day yesterday, and I was reading, forgotten where, probably the Times, about this proposal that many of the veterans who have been so damaged by their experiences in war and find it very hard to move back to society, there has been some suggestions that they become farmers in upstate New York, where farming families are declining because all the kids want to come to the city. And I think that's a sort of, so again, in sort of making visible or widening the conversation, who are the other groups that may also be part of this conversation? Anyway, with that, I would now like to ask Sam, who is sitting right here, Sam Loney from SDSN. And so this is now broadening our conversation of education into a slightly different realm, I think, and also into a global realm. So welcome, Sam, and take it away.
Great. All right. So my name is Sam Loney, and I work at the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, with the SDSN, which was an initiative launched by the Secretary General of the United Nations to mobilize researchers and experts from around the world to create solutions and to essentially bring together that research to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. And in that capacity, I have two roles. One is the partnerships manager for our SDG financing initiative. In other words, how do we finance the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement? And secondly, in my role as the founder and head of program for SDSN Youth, which is the global initiative of approximately 1,000 organizations from around the world across 22 different regional and national centers, all with the same goal, which is about training young leaders in different contexts to create solutions on the ground for the Sustainable Development Goals. So today I'm going to talk to you about our cities program, the Local Pathways Fellowship. So the Local Pathways Fellowship was launched at the Habitat 3 conference in Quito in October 2016. But let me give you some context and background. So I'm sure this issue has been covered pretty thoroughly, but why cities? Firstly, because of the global impact of cities. World cities occupy just 3% of the Earth's landmass, but they account for about 3/4 of global energy consumption. So we can see cities as spatial and geographical locations have a massive carbon footprint. So that's approximately 70% of carbon emissions. They also generate about 70% of the global gross domestic product. So they're responsible for the majority of global economic activity. And that's important to recognize. Additionally, we have around the world trends where 180,000 people are moving into cities every day worldwide. That's equivalent to London or a new San Francisco every single month. That's the scale of urbanization that we're looking at. So, 60% of the world is basically 60% of the world's population is projected to live in urban areas by 2030, and that's going to change to about 75% by the year 2050. So, currently, approximately half the world is under the age of 30. So that's approximately that number is a bit outdated, 3.7 billion young people. This is the biggest generation of youth the world has ever seen. And this generation has a massive impact within their communities and also within the wider sustainable development system. So, firstly, young people are 40% more likely. This huge global population is 40% more likely to move into cities. And that's important to recognize, because that means that cities are getting younger. And this is why they often refer to the Sustainable Development Goals are a young and urban affair. So, a few things to know about millennials, or these young people. A few qualities and a few insights into their work and their behavior. Firstly, they're very innovative. And they're very entrepreneurial. So research shows that millennial entrepreneurs have launched twice as many businesses as their older counterparts, and enterprises and patents. And so they're quite creative. And this is important. Secondly, many of them are incredibly committed to social justice. So 80% of young people made a charitable donation in 2014, 70% spent at least an hour volunteering, and that's a very important thing to recognize. Thirdly, they will account for 75% of the global workforce by 2030, and 80% of consumers. But here's another thing that we should know about these millennials, or shall I say us millennials, is that research shows that millennials tend to value and want to work for companies and for businesses that put a focus on environmental and social impact. So across the various surveys that we've seen, this is a trend that we're starting to see. And that's important, because it means that if companies want to have the best talents and essentially ensure that they have a active and well-engaged workforce, and they can keep those talents, then they have this pressure point of ensuring that their company is committed and acting on social and environmental causes. So these qualities are very important and distinct, which means that we should look at this as an opportunity for the world. Because too often, a lot of young people, and I can show you many publications which I haven't showcased here, are seen as a problem. You know, millennials are this, they only look at their phones, and they're not interested in, the world, and they're too preoccupied with social media. But actually, the research and the trends show something else. So, this opportunity. The world's biggest generation of young people that we've ever seen, and the most well-educated, with very distinct qualities that are important for achieving the SDGs. So, this is essentially the basis from which the Local Pathways Fellowship starts. It is quite simple. Create an opportunity, or create a support system for young people that will enable them to contribute to building better cities and communities. So what that means is equip young people, these individuals in different contexts, with the knowledge, with the skills and tools that are necessary for them to be able to make the right changes within their cities. Because we know that cities need to change, and they need to change rapidly, whether it's decarbonization, whether it's with respect to biodiversity, access to healthcare, communication, etc. So, Local Pathways does exactly that. So we train young people over a period of 12 months from cities around the world, and we train them on how to understand their city better, and then to create an intervention to solve some of the most wicked problems that the city has. So this is how it works. It's a 12-month process divided into 2 segments. So the first segment is research and exploration, where for the first 6 months, we use online MOOCs that are created by SDG Academy and the world's leading experts on cities, such as Aramar Revi, Eugene Birch, and others, to basically create a training and learning program where each month the fellows not only learn about the macro, which is cities, the global level, but also about the micro, in the sense that each assignment, each month, will involve them talking to city officials, talking to local experts to understand how sustainable development localizes within their city. Because it's all good to understand how cities work on a global macro scale, but it's critical that that thinking is applied to the local setting. And that's really the idea of the research project. But it also builds networks, it also enables them to get insights. So it's a research design process and learning. Then the next 6 months, they go on to generate ideas. So based on the research portfolio that they've now created after 6 months on their city, they then identify key intervention points. So where do we need the biggest changes and at what scale? And for the next 6 months, we'll lead them through a design process where they can identify those intervention points and actually brainstorm, talk to experts, talk to stakeholders, and understand how they could build it. So it is really the innovation process. And finally, after 12 months, they have a pretty comprehensive portfolio of both the research and proposed intervention. And then, of course, at that stage, they would have a great portfolio for turning this idea into real, tangible action within their cities. So that means building a team and building a project to be able to do this. That's really the idea. 6 months research, 6 months design, and intervention at the end. So we launched our first cohort in 2018, and we had 60 young leaders from 52 cities around the world. This is them. So a very, very diverse group of young people with different talents, different industries, very interdisciplinary, and very, very different backgrounds. And of course, the cohort graduated at the end of at the end of 2017, and the top candidates were selected to go to the World Urban Forum and present their research and their interventions. But here's the interesting part. A lot of them, a lot of this group, had already gotten support from their local stakeholders for creating those interventions. So they actually, before even we got to the implementation process, they were already on their way. There was one fellow, he's on the far right-hand side, who actually created a policy to address unemployment within cities, and that policy is expected to create tens of thousands of jobs over the next 20 years. And this was a policy he designed as a part of this research project. And with his local government, actually managed to put that into law. So you can see an actual transformation and impact there. Another fellow, Shadnaz Azizi, she's from Iran. She essentially created a project to address urban blight. So trying to essentially address urban poverty in many areas in dead cities or smaller dead cities. And in fact, she got so much support from the government that they said that come and do this for 4 other smaller cities. So she got a contract. And so these are a couple of stories among many of how these fellows, through that research and engagement process, were able to garner support for their ideas and understand where to make these critical interventions. So this year, we had 55 young leaders. We continued the fellowship, and we had them from 40 different cities. As you can see, also a very diverse group of young people. And they graduated, and they were across 51 different cities, not 40, apologies. And you can see, these are the total results, but they graduated just as of a few weeks ago, so we don't have the complete set of portfolios, but that will be available online in a few months, where we compile all their impact, all their stories and research, and we will showcase it at the World Urban Forum in Abu Dhabi in February, so please stay tuned for that. Well, overall, we've had 2 cohorts. We've trained 130 different fellows from 79 different cities, and this has increased 1,000 applicants who we've dealt with so far. So, finally, we have launched the 2020 cohort, and now we're recruiting for that cohort. So, 2020 cohort, we're expanding to 100 cities, and we are going to open the call for application. We have already opened the call for applications, but we're going to close it on the 15th of December. So there is anyone here who would like to be involved in that cohort and would like to be part of this process, I encourage you to apply. Even if your city is not on the list, we still accept outside of it. And this is in partnership and with support of a range of partners, including C40, UN Habitat, and a number of other key stakeholders, and the IIHS, obviously, the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. So this is the local pathways, but I think this is great that we can do this with individuals within 100 cities, but we've got tens of thousands of cities out there. And we need to scale this up at a much higher rate, and also much more expansive, and not just for the big cities, but also looking at the different smaller cities, especially within the developing world. So this is really the program that we have for young people within cities. And I think if you have expertise in this area and would like to work with us, we would love to hear from you. So in summary, this is the Local Pathways Fellowship, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you very much.
And I would also like to say we have at least one fellow in the audience today, which is very nice. William Chan is here, and he is a fellow. And also on our Local Project Challenge website, I think we have 6 or 7 projects that are by the current fellows, so that is really quite nice. The last speaker is Sean Connell from Grow NYC, and he's bringing it back home and bringing the idea of educating in the broader context at a local level. So, Sean, are you here? Yes, here he is. And I should just say that we met Sean earlier this summer when we went to visit Grow NYC, because I'd been to a wonderful presentation of his and Spencer's at the Green Thumb conference, and I thought, ooh, interesting. Anyway, I'll leave Sean to tell you about it.
Great. All right, great. All right, thank you. Thank you for including me in this. I'm Sean Connell. I'm the program manager at Grow NYC, and I manage our teaching garden, which is out on Governor's Island. Has anyone been out to Governor's Island by any chance? A couple folks. Oh, all right. Great, wonderful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a project that we implemented this season at the Teaching Garden, where we incorporated the SDGs into some of our educational programming for public school students and for other folks that we see out at the space. So just a little bit about the organization. Grow NYC, we are an environmental nonprofit. We're about to celebrate our 50th year here in New York City. We like to say that we exist to make the city a more livable place. So we provide sustainability resources for New Yorkers. So a lot of that is in the form of tools and opportunities and things like that that New Yorkers can use to improve the city and the environment. We're probably best known for the green markets or the farmers markets. So if you've ever been to the one in Union Square, that's probably our most well-known market. But we have 54 of them. They're throughout the city. They're all producer-only markets, which is to say that everything that's sold there is produced by the farmers that are selling. So you're not going to find oranges and things like that, which you can't grow in this part of the country. In addition to that, we do some work. We have a wholesale farmers market, which we call a Green Market Co. And then we also have some markets that are run by youth and all kinds of other good things around encouraging sustainable and local agriculture in this part of the country. We also have several initiatives around recycling. If you've been to any of our farmers markets, you've probably seen we have our compost coordinators that are there, and they take food scraps from folks that are shopping at the markets and bring those out to a few facilities throughout the city where they're composted. You may have seen us at events throughout the city where we're helping to sort recyclables from the waste stream. So our volunteers are there in T-shirts, kind of helping give some instruction as people are going for the trash can. We might say, well, maybe that actually could go. That's plastic or that's paper. Let's sort it. When we work in schools and in public housing as well to increase the recycling rate in the city. Our gardening program has been around since the 70s, and a lot of that work focuses on turning vacant lots in the city into community gardens and to open green spaces. So we work in collaboration with Green Thumb, which is the Parks Department's community gardening program. We also work with a lot of the city agencies. The city has sort of a funny history where different agencies are in possession of small plots of land throughout the city, and they don't necessarily have any intention of using them or developing them. So we try to help connect community groups with those plots of land and help them develop gardens. So we've built about 83 of those since we started. We also work with schools. We're sort of the go-to resource in the city for schools that want to start a school garden. So we have over 500 school gardens that we've helped start and that we continue to support. In the last decade or so, we've done a lot of work around rainwater harvesting and helping deal with, mitigate stormwater runoff, which is an issue in this city in particular. We have an old sewer system, so there's some challenges that are posed by excess rainwater, and those challenges are only increasing as the climate becomes less predictable. And we do some work. We have a big annual plant sale, which helps distribute plants to community gardens and schools and block associations and whatnot. And then another program area deals with education. So we do some work in the South Bronx with about 200 teens every year. They manage some garden spaces and help do greening in that sphere. The program that I manage is the Teaching Garden, which is on Governor's Island. And then we also have a few other programs that kind of bring young people out to our farmers markets and help encourage young people to recycle. So, but I'm going to chat a little bit about the Teaching Garden, which is the program on Governor's Island. So it's a 1-acre urban farm space. It serves to deepen the public's understanding of sustainable agriculture, of healthy eating, climate change, and the urban environment. It's really an opportunity for young people in particular to get out of the city and to connect with nature in a way that they might not be able to otherwise. The vast majority of the students that come out to the garden are from lower income neighborhoods and communities that don't have a lot of green space. So for a lot of these students, this is the first time they have gotten a chance to harvest tomatoes off of a vine or plant a seed or things like that. But even more so, it's really it's an opportunity, I think, for them to make a connection with the natural world. We were chatting in the breakout session earlier today about how, this city, while environmentally sustainable in many ways, certainly compared to other parts of this country, there's still a challenge, particularly if you're growing up here, the challenge around sort of finding ways to meaningfully connect with the natural world. And I think that we can't expect young people to care about the environment if they don't really feel that connection, if they don't really understand the value that it can have or that it needs to have in our lives. So this Teaching Garden obviously is not the only solution to that, but it's one way in which we're able to kind of get young people out of the urban space and see how incredible nature can be. So we have a couple different bits of infrastructure out at the garden. We have over 32,000 square feet of intensively planted in-ground rows of organic vegetables and fruits. So this space was a parking lot and a swimming pool a decade ago, less than a decade ago. We came in, we put fabric, landscape fabric over it, and we built a farm space there. We also have about 70 raised garden beds where we do similar, where we garden in a similar way, organically, lots of fruits, vegetables, herbs, that kind of thing. The beds are made out of recycled plastic composite lumber. So they're taking a material that otherwise would have gone to the landfill and are now helping us teach environmental education. We have an aquaponics system. It's a 2-story structure that was created out of a discarded shipping container. It has 750 gallons of water in it. It has about 100 tilapia, and we raise vegetables. If you're not familiar with the technology behind aquaponics, essentially you're raising fish, using their waste to fertilize plants, and the plants help to kind of clean the water, and that gets cycled back into the fish tanks. That whole system is powered by solar panels. It's kind of a Rube Goldberg sort of creation. It's pretty fun to see it in action. We have a greenhouse. We have a season extending high tunnel that's heated only by the sun. So we're able to extend our season, which means we're able to extend our programming out to earlier in the spring and later into the fall. We have what I think has got to be the largest solar cooker in New York City. It's a bank of mirrors that focuses sunlight onto a single point, which can be directed towards the bottom of a cook surface. So on a sunny day, the surface of the solar cooker reaches about 700 degrees Fahrenheit. I was involved in constructing this solar cooker, and we finished it in the middle of winter. It was, I don't know, there was like 6 or so inches of snow, and we gave it a try. We thought it would be important to give it, give it a go by trying to make a grilled cheese sandwich. So I remember this, it was a very it was a good memory. We put butter on the bread, put some cheese on the bread. We put it all on the cook surface. We positioned the mirrors just right, and within 30 seconds, the whole thing was on fire. So the sandwich is on fire. So we knew that we were this solar cooker in fact would work. So the focus of the work we do at the Teaching Garden is, as I mentioned before, it's hosting this free, daily, hands-on, farm-based educational programming for New York City public school students, and also for summer camp groups and youth groups, as well as active and differently abled adults. So most of that programming revolves around students and other participants coming out, getting a chance to harvest and plant in the garden, getting a chance to cook what they harvested, getting a chance to use some of the green infrastructure that I mentioned, the solar cooker, the aquaponics system, the high tunnel. And it's just a chance to really experience these ideas, these concepts in a hands-on way. In addition to our programming for school students, we also do free public programming on the weekends. It's a little less structured, but it's an opportunity for the public just to kind of come in and engage with these concepts. We do that through tours, workshops, all kinds of things. So each season we see about 17,000 weekend visitors. These two young people here were part of a workshop we did where they were painting garden signs. And then the final way that we use the garden is we host groups of corporate volunteers. So we host about 1,500 corporate volunteers every year. And the volunteers help us maintain the garden. They also, as part of the volunteer experience, they make a donation to the program, which helps offset our operating costs. This photo here is very early on when we were building some of the original beds. This is a group of volunteers. And you can see there, we put them to work. So in total, the Teaching Garden hosts about 25,000 New Yorkers each season for our programming. And as Anna mentioned, last winter, my colleague Spencer and I were giving a talk at a community garden focus conference. Anna approached us afterwards and kind of said, a lot of what you're doing already lines up really well with the SDGs. I wonder if you'd be interested in trying to integrate them into the programming you do. I thought that was a really wonderful challenge, and I took it on. And I think it was a good fit for the Teaching Garden for a number of reasons. But one of them is that, in my experience working with the young people that came out there, most of them really were not familiar with the SDGs to start with, but also were not necessarily familiar with the idea that the challenges, the environmental challenges we face in this city are the same challenges often that young people across the globe are facing. So finding a way to connect the work we're doing here with the rest of the world seemed like an important addition to our programming. So we did this in a couple different ways. We integrated the SDGs in a couple different ways, but the key way was that we built 40 interactive SDG-themed displays, which we placed throughout the garden. So we had students help us build these. We had volunteers help us build these. They're really simple. They used reused scaffolding lumber and some scrap lumber. We kind of banged them together, painted them, and each display identifies a specific SDG, and it's paired with a real-world example of that SDG in the teaching garden. So what I mean by that is, I think I have, let's see if this will play. This is a little video of what one looks like in action. Okay, so each of the displays has it has an explanation of, or it identifies the SDG. It has a short description of how it applies to the teaching garden, including the relevant targets. And then there are a few sentences about how visitors can support the implementation of that SDG elsewhere in the city. And then in order to capture the attention of our younger visitors, each sign also includes a cartoon about that specific SDG. So there's the sign, which is at like my level of my knee maybe, but so that's another one of ours. Okay, so a couple of examples. So we have a demonstration space about using green infrastructure for stormwater management in the city. So next to it, we added a display with information about Goal 6, clean water and sanitation. And then inside that display are details about the goal, so how targets 3, 5, and 8 apply to our green infrastructure demonstration. And then there's some information about how green infrastructure can help mitigate stormwater in New York City. Another example, in the center of the garden, we added a display with information about Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities. The display has details about the goal and how the teaching garden offers examples of some of the significant transformations that are needed with how we build and manage our urban spaces. Another example, I mentioned the giant solar cooker. So we added a display with information about Goal 7, affordable and clean energy. The display explains the goal and provides information about how the teaching garden's solar cooker demonstrates that even a simple device can sustainably capture the sun's heat for practical use. So you get the idea. We have 40 of these, so there's some duplicates. And the idea is really to sort of add another level in which people can experience the teaching garden. So when we had student groups out there, those displays were incorporated into our existing lessons. We already, without even realizing, we already covered, 8 of the SDGs. So being able to to draw that connection to good health and well-being, which we do through our nutrition education, the clean water and sanitation, which we do through talking about the water cycle and capturing rainwater, affordable clean energy, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, which as has been touched on already this afternoon, is a topic that's very relevant to young people, and is one I think that elicits the most interest when we bring it up in our lessons. And then of course life below water and life on land tie into the gardening, the in-ground soil gardening we're doing, but then the effects of that gardening on the watershed and the fact that we practice a form of agriculture that tries to reduce runoff and whatnot. On the weekends, we approached this integration of the SDGs in a less formal way. We had a SDG-themed scavenger hunt for children to use, and then there was also an SDG-focused self-guided tour. So if you successfully completed the scavenger hunt, you get to come over and get on our bike blender and make a strawberry smoothie from berries from the garden. So it was a big incentive. And then when we had corporate volunteers, we normally would do an introductory script to tell them a little bit about the teaching garden, about Grow NYC. So we added some language to that script that helped connect the work we were doing at the teaching garden with the SDGs and the larger global movement. So it was a success, I think, overall, and it's something I want to continue to do in subsequent seasons. Our most successful integration was with students, and I think that's in part because we already had the garden-based education, and this tied in really nicely to it. We started doing this program, we started doing this across the board with all of our schools in September, and since then we've discussed the SDGs with 1,600 students. And the majority of these students, we do a little survey before we start our classes with them, the majority of them, 88% of them, had never heard of the SDGs before coming to the teaching garden. So at least we know they walked away having heard about them. In terms of the effect we had on the public, on our weekends, and on corporate volunteers, it was a little bit harder to judge. But many of the visitors that came out on the weekends did try the SDG-themed scavenger hunt and tour. And we got a lot of positive feedback from that. I'd say the corporate volunteers showed the least amount of interest in the SDGs. This might be because of the focus of their event was on volunteering, not education, or because a lot of them are from the financial sector, and this may be a lot of this just sort of out of their wheelhouse. I don't know. And so that's sort of how we implemented it. And then just 2 ideas for action. I think that our experience at the teaching garden was like most folks had really not even heard of the SDGs. So a good thing for those of us in the city to do is just to begin by introducing them into conversation. You can see the project we did this season was actually really very simple, just some signs, some little bit of information. I don't see any reason why that couldn't be implemented in other forms and in other public-facing work that folks do. And then finally, my other idea for action is, and Spencer, I'm sure, can speak to this as well. We're big proponents of the power of community gardens, and so I think gardens are perfectly suited for exploring and demonstrating many of the SDGs. So go out and start a garden or join one. Yep.
So can we have the panelists come up to the table, please? So we've got about 25 minutes for some discussion, and so many issues have been raised. Just as a show of hand, anybody belong to a community garden? Okay. So the scope. There's 500 in the city, and so there's plenty of scope for joining community gardens. Right. I think also what we're going to do right now is put up as backdrop the Alexandria's website, because we didn't get to play that before. So this is going to be the backdrop to the discussion. And also, we might ask you to join the panel if anybody has any questions for her, because part of her activity is obviously very much an educational one. But to kick us off, I think maybe we'll just go straight into questions. Anybody got any burning questions they would like to put to the panel? Or, as Lance did earlier this morning, did any of the presentations suggest to any of the panelists questions for other members of the panel? We've talked about education in a range of ways, and I think it's just really quite wonderful to go from the universities out to the global and then back to the very local and then back to the activism. And all of it is about education. And I think to sort of change our perspective on what education is, I think we get locked into it being something or other. So is there any question that any of the panellists would like to put to each other? Sam, would you like to ask a question of the universities as to how you might intersect with, you know, the way you approach things in the universities? Because there's a lot of overlap, it seems to me.
So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, STSN is a network of universities, and it's about bringing that research, but also then to translate it into real-life practical outcomes. And so having been in the university space for quite some time, unfortunately, too many universities are way too obsessed with deep academic research that sits in a journal somewhere, and that knowledge is never really used. Or not used for to create a change, and that's very unfortunate because I think we're witnessing a lack of research and scientific evidence in a lot of policies, and that's reflected more than anything in the climate movement in particular. And I think being able to bring experts together with practitioners, I think that's absolutely critical to be able to inform their solutions, policy interventions, even their campaigns, right? And I must say that's one very critical aspect of being able to put knowledge to practice. But in addition to that, I actually want to say that while the technical and academic and intervention-based activities are very important for creating change, we also have to look at the bigger picture, which is the overall transformation, in that we will continue to have these same problems, and band-aid solutions, we can generate them pretty innovatively in different places, but we're going to continue to have these problems. We're going to continue to have a rise in carbon emissions and a deepening of inequality unless we're looking at systematic approaches. And one such approach is the incredible work that Alexandra and her colleague Greta Thunberg and many other young activists around the world have done, in that they are putting pressure on the system to be able to limit the damage and to be able to actually shift and create solutions. And I think that's very important. And too often in policy and academic circles, this important phenomenon is not recognized and the impact it would have. And I would say that over the last few months, we have seen the impact of how young individuals such as Alexandria, with their acts of leadership, have been able to really shift the conversation and actually achieve real, tangible outcomes in public policy. And that's very important to recognize.
Perhaps could Harriet pick up on that, because you're engaged in an important sort of phase of strategic planning. And I wonder if you could pick up on some of what Sam
Sure.
has said.
I was just Googling to confirm some statistics, but I don't disagree that sometimes universities face an impossible challenge in that they are, to some extent, fighting for the integrity of the academic project from all kinds of existential forces, whether that's political or whether it's about the industrial partnerships and the nature of those relationships that they're often forced and even coerced to undertake. I was trying to just confirm on my phone the source, but there was a statistic that identified that only 14% of academic papers are ever published, and yet publications is the metric by which academics are validated and judged and even considered valuable enough to promote. So I think that we have, I would say, an infrastructure around the value system of education, of academic activity, that doesn't necessarily, I think, easily facilitate academic responses to real-world problems. But I do think that there is something to be said for maintaining not just a machine for industry, which is in a way how universities were conceived, as this space in which plans could be generated to identify new market opportunities. This is the history of the German model, in fact, in the 17th and 18th century. And they still, looking to the French model of universities, have a place as a space for creativity, exploration, authentic experimentation, and for philosophical understanding of behaviors and the way we do the things we do. So I think that I agree that we could become more responsive, but within that alchemy of multiple constraints, the challenge becomes, what's the impotence? How do we create a policy-led culture that would facilitate, in other words, fund and resource those kind of research inquiries? Because as somebody who's been successful in winning, several €100,000 for research, when you look to see what is available to apply to, the framing of those research bids that would actually facilitate authentic inquiries that could have real-world outcomes are very scarce. So there is very little interest from the big funding organizations to actually facilitate that kind of engagement. But then, speaking briefly as a poet, I was thinking actually about superglue. And the reason I was thinking about superglue is because it was invented to stop Vietnam soldiers bleeding out. So they put this stuff on, and it would, in a very kind of clean way, in fact, seal the wound. And although they couldn't treat the wound, they could stop them just dying from a hemorrhage. And then it became superglue, right? And similarly, Post-its, the glue on Post-its, were a failed experiment to find some kind of enduring adhesive. So I think that sometimes we have to be cautious about always thinking that when we are focused on delivering a strategy, and we've got 3 years to do it because that's the duration of a grant, that we still need to find the space to be more speculative, more creative, to not necessarily always focus all of our energies around a particular prescribed output. And I think that one of the underutilized aspects of a university culture is its multidisciplinarity, or even its exodisciplinarity, because I think the disciplines are essential because sparks fly when hard matter hits hard matter, and unless you have specialisms and expertise, and then you bring that together into a room and really start to think about what those intelligences can do to transform a particular problem, then we're not going to find meaningful solutions. So I still would argue in favor of the institution in terms of its potential, I would say largely under-realized potential, to respond to climate change. But I think, again, we have to look at how policy could create a culture where that could really happen in a meaningful way.
Great. So let's throw the microphone out into the audience and to see if there are some questions coming from this group. One over here, Amanda. Have you got the... Oh, I've got it.
Harriet, this is a question for you. Thank you for that excellent presentation. And if I may, we're showing the slides, of course, of the rather patriarchal past of architecture and the design world. To what extent do you think that a lot of the current mess we are in regards to ecological disasters, bad planning, those omnipotent highways and bad building decisions has been largely because of that, and voices of reason or voices of more sensible voices that were more sensitive to the environment were shut down? Or is there some, I suppose it's a rhetoric question because subconsciously we all know what the answer is, or at least most of us know. Is there a direct relation to that, the past and that culture of machismo and patriarchy and what we see? And even now I notice that when a lot of speakers speak, or even whether in tables or conferences, there are more men speaking or hogging more time than the women who are speaking. And anyway, so the question was going back to your presentation and seeing...
Okay, so let's take another question. I think there's one up the back, or one here.
Or I can answer it.
I commandeered the mic. Hi, my name is Patty, and I have a question for, I guess it's Sean? Yeah, for Sean, but please chime in if you have some input. So it's actually a question about food security in New York City. And I mean, a stat in my brain from a long time ago is that, all of the food that we eat in New York City is trucked in, basically. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sustainability footprint of our food and what can be done about it in terms of what you're doing in a general policy way as well.
Okay, thank you. Another one, there's one up the back as well. Yeah.
My question is for Sam. I think you did a really great job at pointing out how cities need to take center stage. But in my experience of working in like developing countries, people have still not realized that city governments exist as an entity. So like what has been the experience of the fellows that have worked in those cities? And so if they've not recognized cities, then how can they go ahead and implement like SDGs and bigger goals? Thank you.
Okay, so let's take those questions for the moment. We have about another 10 minutes and all, so let's make the responses brief, and we can get a few more questions in after that. Thank you. So, Harriet, I think you were first up. Was it? The question was for you. Yeah.
No, I don't
No.
think it was me. It wasn't.
Sorry, your question was for Sam.
For Sean.
No.
I see what you're doing. My apologies. Okay, get it. Sorry. Yes, so just to very quickly, because it's got to be quick. Okay, I just think that the only way that we can effectively, as a profession, serve society, and by that I mean planet as well, is if our profession is as diverse as that society. So I think it's not necessarily that it's about resorting to any kind of gender stereotyping around the qualities that a male or female, or indeed anyone who with an alternative gender identification may bring to the conversation. It's not about privileging any one of those groups. It's about finding some balance that's reflective of who we are trying to design for. And I think that is the critical problem. And it's not just about gender, it's about class. And it's not just about class, it's about racial diversity, and it's also about regional diversity as well. And making sure that we have stakeholders at the table who aren't in any way forming a majority who can privilege and bias the outcomes towards their particular community and in a way that makes those other communities who are underrepresented suffer or be disadvantaged.
Good.
And you.
The topic of food system in New York City is a really complicated one, but the work that Grow NYC does is based in the idea that encouraging a local food system has economic, environmental, and social benefits. But as it turns out, buying local food is not necessarily always going to be the most environmentally sustainable way to eat. A more sustainable approach is thinking about the seasonality of what we eat, and so I think a lot of the food miles that we end up generating are the result of shipping food from far away when it's out of season. In terms of the work we do in the city around growing food, most of the urban farms and community gardens that are in the city, they're not necessarily production oriented. They're more educational in their mission. Certainly, the city has the capacity to grow some of its food, but I don't think we should we should delude ourselves into thinking that that's the role of the city. I think the relationship between the city and the urban areas, in the rural areas, where most of our food still comes from, is a good relationship, and I think we just need to work on strengthening that.
Great, thank you. Sam.
Yes, so on the cities, critical point. Yes, in a lot of cases, I think a lot of people don't realize that firstly, city governments exist, and secondly, how important they are. But I'm here to tell you that we've had almost a revolution in the power of city governments, and New York City proved that by submitting or reflected that by submitting a voluntary national review to the United Nations High-Level Political Forum. And we're seeing these networks of cities who are banding together to try and make a bigger impact and have a united voice in the front. The compact of city mayors had thousands of city mayors sign up to sustainable development and the SDGs. We have the Global Covenant of Mayors and many, many different networks of cities which are doing incredible work. Not necessarily because of the support of the federal government, but in spite of the support of the federal government, because for transformation and for especially deep decarbonization, cities are much more in the execution phase and not just in planning. And I think that's very important, that cities are engaged closely and they're engaged critically, and that a lot of them actually need technical support and capacity to be able to do this. And I think Local Pathways is an example of how we're providing that. So it has been a learning curve for us in that sense. The second quick point I wanted to make about silos. When I was in my undergraduate course and I was doing research, one thing that I found very annoying is that when I was researching a topic and looking at it from a variety of different dimensions, my professor or my tutor would tell me, ignore the other dimensions and just write about the topic. And I always found that very annoying, because it was like, well, we're not looking at the full picture. It's almost like I'm not saying the truth here. And I think that's reflective, not of all universities or not all sectors of university, but in a lot of cases where universities operate in very specific and very, very siloed academic fields and topic areas. And I think that's a problem, because we know that a lot of these issues are interlinked, and there are lots of research showing the networks of relationships between these very issues. So if we're talking about transformation, we need to break those silos, and they're not easy to break, because a lot of it is determined by the research policies and priorities of different research grants institutes and governments. So this in itself is a systematic problem that needs to be tackled if we are serious about solving some of these incredibly wicked and complex systemic issues. And I think universities should lead the way in being able to break these silos. That's not, and I've talked a lot negatively about universities, but this is to say that despite these challenges, universities are wonderful places, because they're places of convening and bringing a lot of students and leaders of the future together. It's places where research happens. It's a place where it has a huge potential for interdisciplinary work across a range of areas. And some of the biggest companies that we've seen in the world today, whether it's Google, Facebook, WhatsApp, WordPress, Snapchat, all of these were started by college students as part of, not as part of their studies, but as on the side, but also something that the university environment facilitates. So that's very important to also, I think, recognize.
Great, thanks. We're sort of almost out of time for questions right now. What I wanted to do was to end up with a question for Alexandra. I wanted to ask Alexandra a question, which is this. Do you think your education has served you well in preparing you for what you are so very interested and committed to now? And if not, what would you recommend? We've heard this morning about people at these various breakouts, and some of the talks have said every kid should know about the SDGs. So let me just give you a very quick response to that. Could you just give us a quick answer to how's your education served you?
I think the education in schools have actually failed a lot of young people, because right now, at least the schools that I went to and a lot of the young people I've communicated with, a lot of the times what they tell me is all that they've learned is reduce, reuse, recycle. And that's not enough to combat the climate crisis. We need to know more about how to protect our environment and really what to do. And so I think in that way that the educational systems, also what they do is they prepare us to become good consumers and to continue living in this system that is already not going to really survive in the climate crisis. And so with that, that's why my organization, Earth Uprising, you can see it up there, we really focus on educating young people peer-to-peer, because it's now to the point where the climate crisis is in young people's hands and we're educating each other.
Good. Thank you very much. That's a great answer. And I think that peer-to-peer learning is something that certainly organisations like Slum Dwellers International, the massive organisation that has brought together slum dwellers around the world, and that's the way they have learned. Peer-to-peer learning is what it's been about, because they haven't had access to universities or to education in the way that we would know it. So I think that's a very good answer, and I think also all of us can benefit from this peer-to-peer, and I'd say that's what we're doing today. But I did just want to sort of dwell briefly on the last slide of Harriet's. And while Sam's talking about, you know, the lack of interdisciplinarity and being told not to go cross boundaries, I think architecture is the perfect place for that. It's always been eclectic, it's always appropriated, it's always been picking up whatever is going that people think is interesting. And I think that's probably its downfall, but it's probably its utter virtue. So I would say more power to the architects who keep on introducing wild questions and putting them into the dialogue, into the mix. And with that, I would like to thank all these panellists for giving us some terrific insights and moving us ahead with thinking about education and community engagement. So thank you all very much.